We're often told to network if we want to get ahead, but the idea of social capital is about much more than generic networking advice. It shows how your relationships, reputation, and expertise can compound over time and ultimately lead to career opportunities, influence, and even income. So grab your cup of tea and let's talk about the power of social capital. They often say that it's not what you know, it's who you know. And when you understand the idea of social capital, you'll start to see it everywhere. But what happens if you don't have the most elaborate social network? Where do you go? That's why I really wanted to discuss this idea of social capital today. What is it, but how can you also go about creating it? So let's start with what social capital is. The idea of social capital is something that I touched on recently in my episode about cultural capital, which is also a space that I have become really interested in. And it all relates to the work of Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu was a French sociologist who really established some really important foundations in modern sociology. He explored this idea of capital being something that exists beyond economic capital. So, if you notice the people that are able to move through certain circles in particular ways, despite their economic capital, it is because they have also built their capital in other areas as well. His work has had a huge influence on research that has followed in careers, in education, in personal branding, and even in inequality, which is why I really wanted to also have this conversation today, because I know that it can be so hard sometimes when people tell you to network or people talk about this idea of relationships being so important, but you don't necessarily come from those circles that are going to give you the opportunities that things like social capital can unlock more naturally for other people. So, this is why I think it is so important to have this conversation and to show that it is possible for anyone, no matter what background you come from, to be able to understand social capital and create social capital. So, Pierre Bourdieu's work around capital really highlighted this idea that it's not just your economic capital that's important. It's the other elements of capital as well that you can access or accumulate over time and how you convert these into other forms of capital. So, what were the types of capital that he focused on? So, he essentially looked at four key areas. He looked at the idea of economic capital, which is perhaps the most obvious one. This is your wealth and your financial resources, for example. Then there is cultural capital. So, this is your knowledge, your education, your taste, your language, your credentials, your cultural competence, for example. And then there is social capital, which we'll obviously talk about more today. This covers your resources available through your network of relationships. And then there is symbolic capital. So this relates to prestige, reputation, recognition, and status. So to really simplify some of the concepts in Pierre Bourdieu's work, it's not about who you know, it's what those relationships can help you to access. So that is what his work explored. So obviously, relationships are about much, much more than what you can get out of that relationship or how you can leverage that relationship. I don't even think that that needs to be explained. That just goes without saying. But for the purpose of this episode, we are exploring the idea of relationships in particularly a professional sense and really trying to build on the generic advice around networking. So, for example, some of the resources that you might be able to unlock as a result of your relationships could be things like introductions to influential people, it could be job opportunities, it could be insider information, obviously the legal kind if we are talking about that. It could be mentorship, it could be funding, credibility, it could be invitations to exclusive circles. So, what he was really arguing was that your relationships are investments. And P.S., if you're already really aware of the importance of building relationships and you understand this idea of the value of social capital, but you aren't confident in actually building those relationships, then another episode that you might find particularly useful is an episode that I did on how to talk to anyone and 10 really key habits of charismatic people, the people who are able to build great relationships really easily. And that is based on the book, How to Talk to Anyone by Lel Lowndes. So make sure you check out that episode as well. So let's talk about why social capital still matters today, because this work was originally done in the 1970s, but it is still really relevant. So picture, for example, that there are two graduates. Graduate A knows no one in their industry, and graduate B has parents who know executives, has former professors who make introductions, they have mentors who recommend them, they have friends already working in prestigious firms. So essentially, they both have the same element of cultural capital to a degree because they have what is described within cultural capital as institutional capital. That is a type of cultural capital because they have gotten the same degree. But the graduate B, who has these relationships, has more social capital. So they're more likely to access better opportunities than what graduate A is able to. But again, the purpose of this episode is not to dishearten you, it is to show you how you can create that social capital, because that was a really key takeaway from Pierre Bourdieu's work. It was the idea that different types of social capital can reinforce each other. So you can create social capital even if it's not naturally accessible to you. And where I think this becomes really interesting is that since the time that Pierre Bourdieu first did this work, so much has happened in the digital world in that time. This was pre-social media. This was pre the internet boom. So while he did touch on the idea of social capital reinforcing elements of inequality, I personally believe that in today's world, with the opportunities that you have in the digital world, for example, that gap in social capital can be closed quicker than ever before. So if you think, for example, about the people that you follow on social media, maybe they are niche creators, maybe they are the biggest creators in their field. But I would guess that a lot of those people didn't necessarily come from this immediate inherited social capital through their relationships or through the family that they were born into. I would imagine that a lot of those people have become your favorite creators or your favorite influencers from building all of that influence from the ground up. And that is what I think is so exciting about the opportunities that exist now for social capital, is that you might feel really alone in your space, but because of the digital world that we live in, there is the opportunity to create those relationships that you may not have immediately had. So let's look at how you can practically apply this. So for example, say you start to create content. You start to publish articles or a podcast or a YouTube channel or maybe all of the above. And by doing this, you are increasing elements of your cultural capital. That content could then attract influential connections, which will increase your social capital. As more respected people start to engage with your work, this might grow your symbolic capital. And then that recognition might lead to more job opportunities or speaking invitations, clients or partnerships, which ultimately also increases your economic capital. So again, one of the really important points is that capital of certain types can be leveraged to create other types of capital. And do not underestimate the importance of Pierre Bourdieu's work, because in sociology, he is one of the most cited people in that field. And also, as a side note, you might already have more advantages than you realize. You might already have more potential social and cultural capital than you're currently aware of. And a really nice way to explore what gives you an edge already is by checking out a book that I discussed in an earlier episode about your unfair advantage and exploring the Miles framework in that book. Because for me personally, that was a great way to explore the opportunities that I already had available to me that I wasn't really recognizing at the time before I read that book. Okay, so now let's talk about social capital and how that can apply to everyday careers. Consider, for example, the people who are often attending industry events. Maybe they go to the book launches, to the creator events, to Fashion Week, whatever is popular in your industry or in adjacent industries. This can be much more than entertainment or leisure or networking. This is investing because every introduction or every relationship that you are building in those scenarios has the potential to compound, or it will compound over time. So, say for example, a creator meets another creator at an event, and then that person, maybe months later, maybe even a year later, invites them onto their podcast that they host. And then, as a result of that, maybe they are connected with a book publisher, or maybe they are invited to be a speaker at another opportunity. Those interactions can compound into greater social capital. And that is a really key point here. It's that those outcomes aren't random, they are a result of accumulated social capital. So, that is something to really keep in mind if you find yourself at a traditional networking event and you're asking yourself, what am I going to get out of this event? When really you should be asking yourself, what relationships am I investing in for several years? So the goal here isn't to have 10,000 LinkedIn connections. It is to build quality connections. It's quality over quantity. It's to build relationships that are trusted relationships that are going to help you to access opportunities in the future. So, for example, remember that one introduction to the right person, maybe it is a CEO or an industry influencer, can be much more important, much more valuable than having 10,000 connections on your LinkedIn profile. And something that I like to keep in mind when it comes to personal branding, and something that I work with my clients on as well, is this idea of owning a piece of real estate in people's minds. And it is a concept that stood out to me when I read the book 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. This is a classic book in the marketing space. And this relates to law number 3, which says it's better to be first in the mind than it is to be first in the marketplace. And there's a lot that I really love about that idea, because it means that it doesn't matter if you feel like you started with a little bit less of a head start compared to other people, as long as you can be the person who is eventually able to own that piece of real estate in a person's mind. So to be the person that is associated with a particular thing. So when someone thinks of you, they automatically think of you being attached to a particular concept. And this is where I also think personal branding and building your personal brand strategy with intention can be really interesting, because as I talked about at the start of this episode, we're told that it's not what you know, it's who you know. But where I think personal branding can be really valuable is that it also extends on that idea into it being about who knows you, and that through your personal brand strategy, you can make sure that people know you for a certain reason. So, in my own experience, for example, this is something that I really saw play out, particularly when I first started speaking on personal branding, or how I first started speaking in personal branding. So, someone who was quite influential in a particular network, someone that I had known for several years knew that I specialized in this idea of personal branding, and they recommended me to be the person to deliver a presentation on this topic, to be engaged for a speaking opportunity. And when I gave that presentation, there was another really influential person in the audience who then recommended me for a future opportunity. And how that came about was that when that third person was describing a problem that they had, that they wanted to solve for the network that they represented, the person who was in the audience at my presentation said to that person, I know exactly who you need to speak to. So they had connected what he was talking about to my expertise. So that is what I mean about owning a piece of real estate in someone's mind. So when the idea of personal branding came up, that is where that person went, yes, I know who is in that space, who can talk particularly about that space. And where that becomes even more interesting is that because of the networks and the organizations that those opportunities related to, that was able to build my institutional credibility. So it was able to add to elements of my cultural credibility, which was also able to compound into other future opportunities because I had the credibility, the borrowed credibility, the borrowed reputation and recognition from respected institutions to be able to leverage that for future opportunities, which also translated into economic capital as well for paid opportunities. So that is what I mean about being able to leverage different areas of your capital, to convert capital into other forms of capital. And again, I cannot stress enough that relationships, even when you are adopting this idea of social capital and you're aware of this idea of social capital, should not be something that you consider as transactional. They should be something that you are genuinely interested in and that you are genuinely trying to nurture. When I think of some of my earliest personal branding coaching clients, for example, these were people that I had known for years, in some cases even decades. So I had no idea at the time when I was first meeting them that that relationship was ever going to translate into something else, into something related to work. So you never know where your relationships could potentially take you. So remember that that is social capital. It is not who you know, it's where trusted relationships can take you in the future. Thanks so much. Subscribe for more like this, and I'll see you in the next episode.